Hello, dear friends. You're watching NOVYNY live. I am Galina Stapovets. I thank everyone who joined our program already. And many people will see our program live. Many people will watch it recorded. Our today's guest is Garry Kasparov, a leading Russian oppositionist, founder of the Free Russia Forum. Hello, Garry. Hello. I welcome you and I'm very happy to see you in our program. I'm also very happy. I would like to remind you that this is not our first interview, and let me switch to Russian. And I would like to apologize to our audience for this. Right now, all our programs are done in Ukrainian. Besides, Ukrainian is the official language of Ukraine, and I don't practice Russian language for a few years. That's why I may say a Russian word in Ukrainian interpretation, but I think we'll understand each other. Well, as a compromise, we can speak English, and I live in America, and I'm bilingual. So that's why English always can be a compromise. So you can speak Ukrainian. I think I can understand it. I learned it. Yes, for 2 years of the war, there is a lot of Ukrainian speaking on many venues. In fact, we know each other, and I came to Vilnius to meet with you, to do an interview with you. It was 1.5 years before the full-scale invasion, and I rewatched that interview yesterday, and we didn't mention any wars or any aggression from Russia. It was a time of pandemic, everybody was sitting in bunkers, vaccination, isolation, and we thought that back then it was difficult, but then we realized it was an easy version. Do you think that this full-scale invasion, could it have been stopped back then when they just started talking about it? Yes, of course. Many things could have been stopped. Things that happened over the last 23 years under Putin. But probably it's better to say 30 years since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. 32 years passed. The problem is that by the time the Cold War was over and the free world victory, there was a situation in which the victors got laxed, and it turned out that the West didn't have any strategic goal. It seemed like Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was in ruins and unable to take any serious challenges, and the West made a crucial strategic mistake, not having a new vision of the world. When we have these historical turning points, it's very important to have a plan. The Cold War was over, we won, so what's going to be next? And they didn't have this next. Clinton's administration was unable to come up with a new vision of the world. Yes, of course, we won, markets are growing, economic prosperity, but they didn't have a new concept. By the second term of Clinton, the situation drastically changed. Look at 1992-2000 period. At the beginning of this period, America was almighty. It could do anything. It could change the world, could change the UN. And by the way, about the UN, there is still an open question why Russia automatically got a seat in the Security Council. So it's kind of a big question. And America was kind of looking at it from the above. Okay, let's give it to Russia. In 1995, Clinton had a bipartisan support of the Congress in order to use economic levers and not to let Russian-Iranian cooperation, nuclear cooperation. And why to do it? Well, Yeltsin kind of gave us his word that everything will be fine and fine. And of course, everybody remembers in 1994, under the pressure of the West, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, and that arsenal was bigger than British, French, and Chinese altogether, to give you an idea. It was the third one in the world. And they gave it up in return for guarantees. And it turned out those guarantees were just a piece of paper. That was nothing. And it was just the very beginning of everything. And in 2000, we see Putin came in power. The Second Chechen War began. that is accompanied with apartment building explosions that are masterminded by FSB, and Al-Qaeda is getting its strike on America. But still, things could have been changed. But again, the West wasn't ready. Everything was way too comfortable. And George W. Bush tried to do something. His presidency was actually more successful than people think. At least he managed to strangle terrorism in its nest. Though the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan wasn't stable, but at least they were not as audacious as today. And then Obama's time began. Sadly, it continues. And there was this theory that America needs to make friends with everybody, make agreements with everybody. And at this point, a new axis of evil was formed when terrorist dictators and all this totalitarian evil realized that they won't have any consequences. And we begin to see contours of a new world. Or properly to say, it was the old world, because it was returned to the world where the strongest one has all the rights. And at this point, Putin realized that he go as far as he wants. But in fact, Putin never hid his intentions. Restoration of the Soviet anthem as his first act when he became the president, it was already a signal what he has in his head. In 2005, and he openly said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the largest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. To say it one thing, but to do things is totally different. I think at that point he didn't even think that the West will allow him to do all these things. Because we understand today that today's reality is different from the 1930s when Hitler was rising. If we look at 1930s, Hitler, Stalin, also dictatorship, the Japanese Empire, it was also gaining the momentum, Italian fascism. The balance of powers wasn't obvious. In the 21st century, the situation is different. Today, America is a dominating power. But despite its military, economic, and political dominance, America doesn't have what they used to have in Western democracies in 1940s of the last century. I mean, the political will. There is no desire to use this will to keep world intact. And Putin gradually begins to make a conclusion that he can do whatever he wants. When we say it could have been stopped, Crimea annexation was a precise sign that Putin is ready to go further. But before Crimea annexation, there was an event that convinced Putin that nothing will happen to him. This is Syria. Syria was a key point. I spoke about it on American TV, and many hosts, they laughed in my face when I said to them that Obama's reluctance to punish Assad for using chemical weapons, and I have no doubt that Assad used chemical weapons by Putin's order, and if he's not punished, the consequences will be catastrophic not only for Syria, but for the whole world. And Obama got afraid, he retreated, and Putin realized that nothing can stop him. And West's reaction on Crimea annexation and the war in the east of Ukraine was absolutely catastrophic. It turned out that consequences won't be, and they call those consequences sanctions. But you see, now they're preparing the 13th package of sanctions. And where is Angela Merkel, who said that without Russian gas, Europe will freeze? Where is Obama, who in 2012, during presidential debates, when Mitt Romney said that Russia is the main geopolitical enemy of America, and Obama was laughing at him, and all the liberal press was laughing at him? Where are all these people? And by the way, many of these people are now in Biden's administration. And this is the answers to the questions. Why Biden's administration acts like that? Because in general, this mentality didn't go anywhere. Could it have been stopped? Yes, of course. Americans knew that the invasion will happen, and they did nothing to stop it. Moreover, the 2nd of February, 2022, the Congress of the United States hearings, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Milley, he was against providing Ukraine with serious weapons because, according to Pentagon, Ukraine wouldn't stand even for 2 days, and all these weapons will be taken over by the Russians. It is such a disgrace to hear it from the man who 6 months before that left billions of dollars of American weapons in the hands of bandits of Taliban. And by the way, remember this disgraceful flight from Kabul. Americans were running away from Kabul, from the gangs of those insurgents armed with machine guns. They could have been destroyed by one regiment of American Marines. America was running away, and I think for Putin this footage from Kabul was just a revelation. If America is running away from those, so it's just funny. They can't even normally leave the country. So save the people who worked for you. 350,000 Afghanis who worked for Americans, they turned into hostages of Taliban. Weakness only provokes the rapists for more violence, and the weakness of the free world never brought us to a mutually beneficial solution. Compromise with dictators is impossible, and as I said, you don't make agreements with cancer tumor, you cut it out. We see now that Putin's actions, they are related to the reaction of the West. In February of 2022, he knew that nothing would happen to him. We know now that Americans are making agreements with Zelensky to establish Ukrainian government in exile. They were ready to communicate to Putin's puppet. If Putin tanks got to Kiev for 3 days, as it was planned, today they would be negotiating with Yanukovych, Medvedchuk, all those Putin's puppets, all these Bidens, Scholz. Sadly, today we're dealing with people whose caliber is not enough to make historical decisions. Could Putin have been stopped? Absolutely. Impose very tough sanctions. But it should be understood that sanctions don't stop tanks when the tanks cross the border. But sanctions may prevent them from crossing the border if the price is too high. At the point they cross the border, confiscate all the money right away, all this $350 billion. Don't wait. Everything is closed, all the diplomats and ambassadors sent away. Many things could have been done. But now what we see? Huge losses. Thousands of dead. Millions of refugees. The country is destroyed, and this is Ukraine. Look now at Israel's war, that is also provoked by Putin and his Iranian bandits. Venezuela, that is right on the verge of explosion. China, that is drooling over Taiwan, and this is the result of weakness. And every day the price is rising. The price to stop mad dictators and terrorists rises every day, and today we see that Americans in the Middle East, they begin to do something, but they didn't do much. But already 3 soldiers are dead, dozens of wounded, and who is shooting at them? Some shagrag Houthi. I could understand when American soldiers were dying in the war with Japanese fleet or with German tanks during the Second World War. But what this? This is the gang of bandits that Americans can get rid of. Everybody knows where Iranian bases are. So what about the strike on Iranian bases? So it's not on the agenda anymore? Why? Everything can end very fast. America is so much stronger that nobody will have any questions. But again, the strength without a political will won't do today. Going back to February 2022, when everybody knew that the invasion would happen, and Americans kind of said goodbye to us as a country, 2-3 days, and Ukraine surrenders, in what world they were planning to live after that, when one neighbor attacks the other neighbor, invading this country, destroying everything on its way, people, towns. In what kind of world the West was planning to live after all that? See, but the West doesn't look so far. And again, I repeat, they have this mentality formed for 30 years. Kind of, don't touch me, I'm here, and I'm ready to compromise. First, make compromises. That's why all this talks of Biden that we will be protecting every centimeter of NATO territory, but this is just words, just like the paper that they're written on. They say NATO Article 5, this is stuff, and Budapest Memorandum is nothing, but these are just papers. All of them are just papers. That's why it's all about political will. The presence of political will, this is what let you make decisions and implement them. Papers are nothing. Everybody understands, if America is not ready to help Ukraine win, then nobody will be protecting Lithuania. And they won't protect Lithuania, because the price will be different. they'll have to send their troops there. If we listen to American and German politicians, say Scholz, or his Minister of Defense, Pistorius, this is a form of political insanity, because in the same speech, in the first part of the speech, they say we shouldn't give Ukraine missiles and modern weapons because there will be escalation. And the second part of the speech, escalation is inevitable, so we have to get ready for the war with Russia. But this looks like you're in a mental clinic, because these two statements can't agree. We will be getting ready for the war with Russia, in which our soldiers will die, because we don't want to give Ukrainians weapons to prevent this war. Just slowly play it back. And these are serious politicians. Biden's administration, I don't want to talk about it at all, because it's catastrophe after catastrophe. Afghanistan, Ukraine, Israel, Iranian problem. This is the result of reluctance to take radical measures. The meeting of Biden and Putin, I also think, was a disgraceful decision in June of 2021. And they met not to stop a potential invasion of Ukraine. That was an attempt to make global agreements, and Ukraine was a bargaining chip. Current administration continues what Obama administration was trying to do, making agreements with Iran. This is Americans' attempt to step aside. The world should manage on its own. And these are vicious talks of American leftists who are sure that the world suffers because America gets engaged in global issues too often. If America doesn't do that, everything will be just fine, and we know the result. There is a political vacuum that is filled by Putin, Iranians, bandits, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Chinese. This is some sort of historical physics, if you wish. Historical patterns that nobody can avoid. But the problem is that people who lost everything, who failed at everything, that can't resolve those issues, they're still at the helm. And we can clearly see what's going on in the United States today, in the Congress. The American Congress doesn't give the money, Republicans. They cannot do their thing. But the problem is not only with the Congress. Among Republicans, they are pro-Trump Republicans who say the worse is better. But the problem is that the administration didn't answer the most important question after the invasion. What is the goal of the war? In November, Republicans presented a memorandum with 12 points, and the key point was, tell us what we are spending taxpayer monies for. Say these words, Ukraine must win. They didn't say these words. So far, the goals of the war are not clearly stated. Another thing that's important, Americans, this administration, didn't consider the end of the war in light of possible victory of Ukraine. In their view, it may cause geopolitical calamities that this administration is not ready for. And based on this, you can explain everything else. Why they didn't ship jet fighters, why Crimea Bridge is still there. The fact that the Crimea Bridge is still there is just a monument to disgrace of American administration. This bridge could have been destroyed for a week using American missiles, and Ukraine could have done it. And in fact, that could have been not only a strike on Russian army logistics, but it would have been a great strike on the symbols, on Putin's reputation, because dictators, they need symbols. Remember when Prigozhin's mutiny was? It was in June of the last year, when Russian elite was panicking. They were expecting Ukrainian offensive, and people who were thinking the same way as Prigozhin, they knew the balance. If America gave all the weapons that it had promised, then the war would have been over last year. But all of a sudden, it turns out that nobody gave the weapons, and it somehow decided Prigozhin's fate. And obviously today, Russian elite who consolidated around Putin, they now feel like king on the hill. And look at Biden, who is like trembling of horror, and Scholz, who is mumbling something. And of course, there are Poles and Baltic countries, but what they can do, they don't have so many weapons. So we have a situation of the system crisis of the whole global system. And Ukraine is a convergence point of all of it. And the fact that the war in Ukraine didn't finish as it could have been finished, as the victory of Ukraine and the flag of Ukraine in Sevastopol last year. So it caused the spreading of the war. Hamas's attack, it's not just Iran, it's Putin too. Exactly, because now it drew the attention to Israel. And it will continue like that. Don't forget about Venezuela and their claims for Guyana. And it will be spreading just like cancer. And as I said, no agreements with cancer, we just need to cut it out. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel, given what's going on right now? I don't want to make dark predictions, but we need to understand the situation is hanging in the air, and it depends a lot on the presidential election in the United States. Though there is a great probability of repetition of scenario Biden-Trump, and I think it's a disgrace of American democracy, because one of the candidates represents infirmity, feebleness, and the other one represents corruption and crime, and it will do great harm to American democracy, and mainly to the image of America in the world. And of course, all that will inspire Putin and Xi Jinping and Iranian mullahs and all of them in the list for new actions. But it's not a 100% guarantee. I think that in the Republican Party, the battle of Nikki Haley and Trump is still going, and we need to pray Nikki Haley, who will win over Trump, will change all American discourse. She's a consistent follower of Reagan's politics and bring America back to the world. We need Nikki Haley in the White House, and the war will be over in 6 months, or 3 months even. Let's just dream. So Nikki Haley wins the election. Putin will come up with peace terms right away. He'll try to make agreements because everybody understands the balance. There won't be any Crimea bridge, nothing. The Denmark Strait will be closed, and the missiles will come to Ukraine in such quantities that Russian generals will strangle Putin if he doesn't make agreements. And China will forget about Taiwan. Xi Jinping won't even look in that direction. Because President Haley would say like this: another provocation, I recognize Taiwan, make an agreement with them, so please, back off. Everybody will back off right away. Venezuela's President Maduro will stand to attention and will say right away, so I'll stop selling cocaine. We understand that one American division will bring order in Venezuela. The UN, we know what UN is about. All these UN humanitarian officials were helping Hamas to mastermind this operation. So we know what the UN is about. So there are ways, let's put it this way. So let's dream. It doesn't do any harm. And I think Nikki Haley is not hopeless in this battle. Though Trump's chances are much higher, nevertheless, the fight is still going in America. There are political forces, quite substantial, and financial resources that are intended to bring America back to the global arena. I also would like to hear your point of view, why the West and the United States are so afraid, having such an incredible political, economic, and military power. What is the point of their fear? As I understand, they have interceptors that can deter this attack. The reason is not clear. No. Listen, nuclear weapons, this is a boogeyman for the public. It doesn't have anything to do with real countries. These fears, they have to do with the fact, with the idea, if we're talking about Americans, there are two levels. First one, it has to do with geopolitical fears. This is the mentality of Kissinger. There is Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. One of the centers gets weak, and it will be a problem for Washington. Say, Ukrainian victory, destruction of the Putin's army, Ukraine wins, Ukrainian flag is in Sevastopol. The probability of collapse of Putin's regime gets to 100%, because dictators usually don't survive a loss in the war. And the consequence is the disintegration of Russia, and the consequence is the strengthening of China. So the idea is to keep the balance, but they're trying to keep the balance based on the cliches of the 19th and 20th century. In 21st century, it doesn't work, but those who are now at the helm of the American policy, they don't really think in terms of 21st century. That's the first problem. The second problem is a domestic one. In fact, Biden administration is a continuation of Obama administration. They would like to deal with the domestic issues. It is a very leftist agenda that includes rejection of hydrocarbons, changing the structure of the society. It's kind of a long story. America, as a global problem solver, doesn't fit in this story. And again, the main philosophy here is that problem exists in the world because America is bad, and those who develop this philosophy, they are sure that America is founded on wrong principles. Many of them, let's put it this way, they think that free world and capitalism are the sources of the problem. And when these two elements, as geopolitical fear and the domestic policy, kind of merge, we have a situation when the victory of Ukraine and the collapse of Putin's Russia look like a harbinger of doom, because it brings chaos, more engagement of America in solving global issues, and in fact, rejection of all the simplified schemes of perception of the world that are imposed by the leftist agenda in the United States. And naturally, it's an ideological collapse, a geopolitical fear and ideological collapse. These are the real reasons. All the rest are just kind of foam on the surface, say like a smoke screen, like an octopus, ejecting the ink. You often write on your Facebook page that today the current American administration, represented by doves of peace, they have these backstage negotiations with Moscow. Do you understand it correctly? See, I wasn't present at those negotiations, but obviously everything that's happening has to have some logical explanation. And this explanation brings us to the conclusion that some negotiations are held. For example, who are advisors of the current administration, those who consult Jake Sullivan, for example. Samuel Cherub, absolutely meaningless, completely failed analyst who used to say that Ukraine would fail, don't give weapons to Ukraine. He worked for a private corporation. So he visited Sullivan 13 times. That is on the record, that his visit to the White House. It doesn't mean that they didn't meet in other places. Cherub and Tom Graham, the consultant of the previous administration, Republican administration, who kind of followed this policy of Putin Freistein, making agreements with Putin's administration. They many times met with the representatives of the Russian government, not official, but the key person here is director of CIA, Mr. Burns. He's a professional diplomat. In 1990s, he was against NATO expansion. And again, his vision of the world has to do with that triangle that I mentioned. That's why Moscow is a part of negotiations. But Kiev, Warsaw, Berlin, these are all secondary. This is how he sees the world. Of course, he made agreements with his Russian so-called colleagues, with Narishkin and Patrushev, and I'm sure that he promised them that American weapons won't be used against Russian facilities. I would love to see Burns in the Congress testifying with his hand on the Bible, but Republicans are not ready for that. It would be great to see him and Sullivan, and all the questions that are listed could be asked to them with their hand on the Bible, and potentially any lie would be a criminal investigation. The questions were not asked. Recently, Burns wrote an article in which he reconsiders operations of CIA that he runs today, and I think It is a typical example when his incompetence and total failure of his policy are covered by shifting the blame onto institutional issues. Obviously, they tried to make some agreements. In my view, what is most probable, and actually it was never objected by the administration, and it was one of the reasons why Americans disagreed to give green light for Ukraine to be a part of NATO, they came up with this idea of separation line, something like East and West Germany. As a carrot, they would admit this part of Ukraine to NATO, and they would give this confiscated Russian money to Ukraine. The problem of this Bern-Sullivan concept is that Putin doesn't agree with that. Why would he if he can get more? And today's paralysis of American administration is that it doesn't have chances to move forward. And they also understand that sanctions today is like water in the sea. The main part, technological part of Russian drones is not just Western, it's American. And when they tell me, yes, we help Ukraine, can't you just close down this channel? But yes, they do it through third countries. But we live in the world where we can track this down. And it's very easy to do if Burns or Sullivan don't know this. So just choose one company and punish them to set an example. And punish them in such a way that they have to close down their business. And the matter will be resolved once and for all, both for Americans and Europeans. That's it. Today we have a situation when sanctions can be easily avoided by channeling export to the third countries. How is it possible? European experts, and actually countries that protect Ukraine, defend Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Finland, let alone Germany. But all the export goes to Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Kyrgyzstan just became a trade hub. Trade volume of this country grew tenfold. But again, in the free world, you can't stop it, only because you don't have a political decision. War means that you take part in the war and you do everything to stop your enemy from achieving their goals. Back to this political insanity when they say we need to get ready for the war with Russia, but today when we have an opportunity not to send our troops there, we can just start strangling Putin's Russia economically, and they say they can't do it because it will make Putin's Russia uncomfortable. In other words, it's better if our soldiers die 2 years later instead of not giving money to Putin to use this money to kill our soldiers later. So can I repeat this again? This is what the Western politicians say. The main export that Russia has is oil export. Russian oil tankers, they use not Novorossiysk port, but they use the northern route through Denmark Strait. Is it difficult to close the strait? Okay, fine, you can't do it, so introduce such a duty that Russia doesn't want to pay. So of course, Russia may apply to WTO and all that kind of thing. But today, they wouldn't be able to trade. But free trade, oil market, so they don't want to harm it. So this is how it happens. What Reagan did, he made an agreement with Saudi Arabia, they increased oil production, and they made Soviet Union bankrupt. Because they had a goal. It's empire of evil, we need to fight it. Today, we don't have this goal. The goal is blurred. The simple question, what we are fighting for, doesn't have an answer. I receive many questions, and many people in Ukraine are interested in what's happening to the American aid, military aid. It's important to understand it's not purely aid. Estonia helps Ukraine. They give what they have in stock. In Poland, this issue is more complex. They receive stuff from Americans, and then they ship to Ukraine. American support is very particular. They don't do it selflessly. They ship old military equipment, and they put the new instead. And 35 billion out of the 60 billion, this is the money that will be used to refill the stock. They have lots of weapons. 2,500 tanks are in California desert. Different jet fighters are there too, and they're not used. Recently they shipped about 100 tanks to Morocco. Of course, it's very important in Morocco, but they shipped only 31 to Ukraine. And it took a lot of time. They had to re-equip those tanks. 31 tanks Americans shipped to Ukraine. How can you explain that? But jet fighters are not shipped yet. America has all necessary resources. They don't need Congress decision. If Biden's administration wanted the war to be won, they have weapons in stock to make it happen. Oftentimes, to simply destroy the old weapons and replace them with new ones in these warehouses, it is more expensive than to ship the weapons to Ukraine. They build those weapons to stop Soviet aggression. The moment came and they don't use the weapons. And in fact, they don't need any Congress decision. They just write it off, they put $1 value to it, because it's supposed to be written off. It is operational, but it's not the key weaponry for Pentagon in their military concept. And all these weapons could be shipped to Ukraine long ago, and the war would be done. Instead of that, they have this tug of war. Republicans blame Democrats, Democrats blame Republicans, Trump, Biden. Biden is in power. Trump is bad, but Biden is in power today, and this is Biden's administration that for 2 years doesn't give Ukraine the weapons that would finish the war. It would take only a few months if America made this goal without any losses among American soldiers. Few questions to you, Garry, in the same key that you just spoke about. How do you see the finale of this war of Russia and Ukraine, and when it may happen? In fact, it's very important to figure out with the semantics of the word. You said war, but the war started in 2014. The war is going on for 10 years. And here we're talking about armistice, the cease of fire, or the end of the war. It's very important to understand this, because oftentimes they kind of merge these two definitions. The war won't end soon. It will end only with the collapse of Putin regime and with the Putin army. There is no any other way to stop the war, to finish the war, and to restore Ukrainian integrity. So it's not going to be finished tomorrow or this year. So is it possible to stop military actions? I think in principle, yes, it is possible, but also the probability is very low. But it's possible to do it because resources of both sides are not infinite, and no matter how arrogant Putin is, Russian resources are not endless. Of course, in Russia they have 140 million people, in Ukraine 40 million, the different potentials, but don't forget that Putin doesn't risk to announce total mobilization. Big centers such as Moscow and St. Petersburg are not touched by mobilization. There is no mass mobilization. There are like 10 million in St. Petersburg and about 30 million in Moscow and the Moscow region. It's quite a big, it is a significant layer of society that is not involved. And besides, in Russia there is a lack of staff. And sanctions do impact in some way. Sanctions will be increased, and at some point there will be confiscation of some of the funds. When we're talking about confiscation of funds, in the West they can't really say how much money they can control. They say about $300 billion, but trust me that this number is an approximate number. And in fact, in why the West is so vague about it, they gave 3 dates from 24th to 28th of February back in 2022. They cannot let Putin's emissaries to kind of withdraw some money, but it's a lot of money. It's billions. In America, they say 38 billion. Ministry of Finance says that they can control only 5 billion. But nevertheless, it's in billions. Is it possible to confiscate this money? Yes, it's possible. The organization that established in the US many years ago, we help Ukraine very actively. And Larry Tribe, one of the leading American lawyers, he's a patriarch of American constitutional jurisprudence, and we prepared a report, and in this report it is stated that the president has authorities without Congress, and a whole list of references to different precedents, and the report is called Making Putin Pay, and it says how the money can be confiscated. And so they can make an agreement with Europeans, and of course everybody's afraid what's going to happen in financial systems. But listen, the war is going on. People die. Maybe some decisions can be made. Europe confiscates only interest of Russian debt. There's like 300 million euros. This is how much they confiscated. It's really laughable, but at least something. So they're not ready to make decisions, and there are many decisions they could make. One of the decisions is to issue bonds that will be secured by frozen money. It's kind of hidden confiscation. But again, they need a political will. They have resources, and clearly that this confiscation will be quite painful for Russia. So, and if they have desire to kind of close export to all those third countries, they can do it. It doesn't require some sort of creative mind to do that. Everybody understands why it doesn't happen. Because there is no political decision to finish the war. And as soon as it's clear that the war should be finished with the victory of Ukraine, immediately they will start taking measures, these irreversible measures, that are in the arsenal of Western politicians. Angela Merkel, for 16 years, she was telling that without trade with Russia, there will be a catastrophe in Europe. But it turns out it's possible. With 13 packages of sanctions already accepted. So if they did it before, then Putin would be thinking whether he can invade Ukraine. And my last question, so about what's going on in Russia, it's not so rosy as they say. What's happening in the middle of the country? What's happening in the Kremlin, in the elite, those birds of peace and those war hawks? So what people think? They lost about 200, 300,000 people, and maybe in some places it's actually quite noticeable. Nobody can give you an answer to this question. Nobody knows what's going on in terms of public opinion. Who can answer these questions? Well, actually, losses are much more. There are more than 300,000 dead, and I think Ukrainian estimates are quite right. But also, Ukraine lost a lot, also in hundreds of thousands, and soldiers who die later after all these wounds and injuries. So those losses, they should be noticeable, but what's important, so if everything happens beyond the borders of Moscow and St. Petersburg, you can't really see it. Russia is very big, and that's why Putin does not declare mass mobilization, particularly in Moscow and Moscow region. From time to time, they do receive coffins and injured soldiers, but it's not quite noticeable. But what's happening in the distant villages, in like Buryatia Republic, in Siberia, and in cities there, so they can't see it. It's far from Moscow. Economically, they still have the resource, and don't forget this military economy gives a certain boost to the economy, and GDP is growing because of the military production. So they managed to avoid sanctions, and again, the lifestyle in the big cities is not critical yet. The Kremlin. I think there was a point before the Ukrainian offensive, there was sort of panic, and Prigozhin's mutiny was sort of a desperate gesture to stop the war, kind of get business back to normal. But as of today, this group that was back in Prigozhin, if it still exists, it kind of stays put, because their main business has to do with the war. they make their money on the war. So Russian elites, they consolidated around Putin because the war is the source of their income. In Russia, corruption is not a problem, it's a system. And what it implies is those who are in power just suck on the budget, and where the biggest budget is in military. So until they have the direct danger of military collapse, they will be consolidated around Putin. That's why I don't expect any changes. And all those rosy dreams of Russian immigration that something might change and people wake up, election and all this is just circus, a decoration, doesn't have anything to do with real life, only victory of Ukrainian military forces. That's why Free Russia Forum interacts with the Ukrainian military, helps Russian battalions that fight against Putin's army. So everything that we can do is also political interaction, political cooperation. So that's the only way for us. Freedom of Russia starts with victory of Ukraine. This is our concept, this is our idea. Sadly, victory of Ukraine equals freedom of Russia. Only minority says that in Russian immigration. So I am part of this minority. I'm used to being in minority. But actually, to hope for changes within Russia, we can't really hope for that. The best thing that the West can do, I speak about it, Mikhail Khodorkovsky speaks about it. The West may try to ensure that the intelligent people from Russia could leave Russia. Clearly, the number of people that make missiles and do engineering, some financial stuff, this number of people is quite limited. And if we had a chance to create sort of virtual Taiwan, kind of virtual Russia, that would be outside of Russia, that of course would help military efforts of Ukraine, because this would weaken Russia, and this is a war where you need to use creative approaches. And again, we have the same issue, a lack of political will to accept a simple fact that unlike chess, it doesn't have a draw. It's either Putin wins with all the dictators or Ukraine wins with the free world. Thank you, Garry, for your position, for helping Ukrainian military forces. Thank you very much for this extremely interesting conversation. Sadly, our time is up. We have a lot of questions to ask, and I hope we'll have more chances to see each other virtually like this and to discuss what's going on in the world, and there are many things to discuss. Thank you very much for this conversation. I would like to remind you that with us we had Garry Kasparov, Russian opposition leader, the founder of Free Russia Forum. Thank you very much for watching this interview. Thank you for your comments. Take care.